Mustang Monday, April 22nd. Starting to get a little worried. Everybody that I know that is involved in this project in any way, shape, or form, my wife, my father, or anything, is starting to remind me that we're getting pretty close to the tour. I'm beginning to get the impression they don't think it's going to be finished. They might be right. Most of what was done this weekend was wiring related. I finally have the wires remotely separated into the different areas that they need to go to: front of the car, back of the car, steering column, dash, ignition, things like that. Several of the switches are wired up. The relay panel is together and ready for me to run relays for the horn, the fan, fuel pump eventually, all of those good things. I have a temporary location for the fuse block for the wiring harness. That's not where it's going to stay, but that's where it is for right now. Hopefully this weekend, or this coming up week, I will be able to get a good chunk of the wiring finalized and I can start testing this car. I've got a radiator, a carburetor, different accessory parts, components and stuff like that, lights to finish this installation. One of my favorite things about projects like this is it feels like Christmas time with all the packages coming in. Got a bunch of orders from a bunch of different companies this week. Headlights, wires, relays, relay switches, distribution blocks, all sorts of stuff. I bundled a bunch of heavy gauge wire together and ran it to the front of the car. These are going to be the wiring for the headlights and fan and horns. Once I had that done, I made a little list so that I could keep track of which wires were going to go where. Ran it through some split loom with a generous run, so it was a little extra, and then made the connections to the connectors for the headlights. Temporarily attached the split loom, put the fenders on, and just tested to make sure that I had enough extra wire run to go to the headlight buckets to give me a room to work on them if I needed to, and the rocker lights. Then scraped away a little bit of paint for a ground strap for the headlights. After I was done guesstimating wire length, I just kind of put things back together temporarily so it was nice and neat and orderly and not hanging all over the ground. So I'm working with 50-foot coils of wire, and I didn't really want to cut them until I knew what I did. I went inside the car, unwound them all, and bound them up with the other way, and then I ran them in a kind of a loop to the other fender well. And then I did the same thing. It was at this time that I realized that I was going to have too much wire run in one loom, so I was going to have to double split loom it. While I was playing with the split loom, I ran ahead and ran the ignition wires that were going to go to the distributor for the tach and ignition. The insulation, stuck some heat shrink over there, pulled the pigtail on the distributor, joined the two wires and wrapped them real tight with some single strand copper wire, then used some flux and soldered them as solid as I can solder, which is a pretty good connection. I pulled on it real tight and it didn't work. It didn't come apart. And then stuck the heat shrink over and wrapped them up. Back inside the car, I spent a little bit more time wiring up the headlight harness. And then got started on the relay panel. The relays that I came in had the red wires in the center, and I didn't need that particular connection, but I wanted the red wires. So I pulled the red wires out of the center, and then on the relay, I pulled the power in out, which I think was the blue one, and then replaced all of the blue wires with red, so that I kept voltage in red and blue was for something else. So if you're not familiar with the use of relays, here's what happens. Power comes in here on a heavy gauge wire. Most switches aren't designed to handle the load that something like a fan or a halogen light, large capacity fuel pump, or any of those type of things will use. So what you do is you bring power in here to this distribution block. This distribution block distributes that power to each one of these relays. The yellow wire goes out to the accessory, for instance, the horn, the fuel pump, the cigarette lighters, fans, any of that stuff. The white wire controls the switch. So you run the switch into here. When you flip the switch, it tells the relay to open. It takes the power that's from the red wire and sends it out to the particular accessory from here. So it allows me to run a much heavier gauge wire out to the accessory so I can run a longer run and not take a chance on drawing too much that keep your headlights from dimming, or you putting too much stress on the electrical system and possibly creating a hazard or fire. Took a piece of Kydex, set the relays out approximately where I wanted them, and drilled some holes to attach them. Cleaned out the holes so that they were big enough for the screws, and loosely attached everything so that I could start running wires. Laid out a couple of straight lines across the panel so that I had a nice, even place to put the distribution block. I could keep it lined up. Drilled a couple holes and fastened it down. Once I was sure that it was where it was going to go, I went ahead and drilled all 4 holes and secured it real tight so it couldn't move while I was doing the wiring. With the distribution block securely mounted and the relays temporarily mounted, I started on the first wire. I cut it, put the heat shrink wrap on there, crimped it, and then melted the heat shrink. And that was when I realized this was probably going to be a lot easier to do if I just went ahead and marked all the wires and then took them off the panel first. So I took it apart, went through, stripped all the wires, connected them all, heat shrinked them all, and then turned it back over, checked it to make sure that everything was lining up the way I wanted it to line up, and I moved on to the next set of wires. But before I could start on the next set of wires, I needed to figure out where I was going to put these distribution blocks. I left a little bit of room for the heavy gauge wire to run up from beneath on the side to the right. Your right, my left. But anyways, secured the distribution blocks down, got them all in place on the left side, and started running wires. Now this is where I made my first mistake. I was originally planning on running all the grounds to the distribution blocks on your left side, and then I realized that I wasn't going to have enough blocks. So instead, what I did was I drilled holes in the Kydex, and I ran the ground wires underneath. The plastic shouldn't be able to cut through the wiring, and if it does, it makes a ground. Well, it's already a ground, so not ideal, but I'll do something to protect them a little further down the line. Now that I had changed my mind, I had at least a way to measure the wires. I just used and cut the yellow wires the same length as the black wires because they were going to the same place. And then went through the same process. Stripped, connect, put the heat shrink tubing on it, and shrunk it. And then it was onto the distribution block for the white wires. I had everything out. I went ahead and measured and drilled the holes for the ground on the other side. I'm going to end up with 10 relays, 5 on each side. Tried to keep the wires nice and relaxed so that there wasn't too much tension on either one of them or on any one of them. But I also tried to lay them out nice and neatly so that they looked like something that might resemble something that somebody who knew what they were doing would put together. And then it was time for actually attaching the wires. Once I had the wires attached where they were going to go, I flipped it over and put washers, lock washers, and nuts. They didn't have any nylon insert nuts on the back of the panel. Make sure that nothing was going to come loose while I was driving. And I had accidentally cut one of the yellow wires a little too short. So what I did was I pulled one of the wires from the other fuse or other relay panel and replaced that one and recut it with a little bit more slack. And then I just stuck the one that I had already cut kind of in the middle so that I'd have more room. And then went through and attached the distribution block and then the switches and the accessories and laid it in the Mustang, checked to make sure that it was going to fit, again, because I'd already checked that once, and started laying out the wires that were for the switches, the signal switches, and then the wires that were going to go to the accessories. Now, while I was in there, I unbundled the wires that go to the back of the car for the taillights, the sending units, and all of the other wonderful things back there. Unjumbled that giant mess of heavy gauge wire, or tried anyways. Since I needed to make a temporary mount for the fuse panel, and I took a piece of 14 gauge aluminum, cut it down to a size, and put a bend in the middle of it. This isn't how or where the thing is going to be mounted in the long term, but for the tour, I can't just leave it flopping around the car, so I've got to secure it to something. And I apologize for the slightly out of picture, out of focus thing. I was playing with a different lens on the camera just to see what it would do, and yeah, anyways. Using a couple of the factory mounting holes that were already there, I marked it, put it in a Mustang, marked it, drilled the holes, put some threaded inserts in there, then put it back in there to make sure that it was lined up, got everything squared up, marked the second hole, and then did the same thing. Drilled it, put an insert in, and put it back in one more time to check to make sure it lined up. I took a hole saw and some shears and cut out a notch so that the wiring can go through there, and that way it's not pressing against this aluminum, just causing it to break or damage or anything like that. And filed it down and stuck some Gorilla Tape to use as a temporary gasket until I can find a gasket that is of the appropriate size. Wiring is just something that I wasn't able to rush. I wanted to take my time. The car doesn't do me a lot of good if it catches on fire in the middle of the tour. So kind of slows me down a little bit, but in my opinion, that's a pretty important thing to get right. If I can get this car on the road by middle of May, that gives me roughly a month to function test it. I'll feel pretty comfortable that if I drive it for 2 or 3 weeks without any major issues, that it'll make the tour, particularly since it's pretty basic. Whether or not I'll be able to get the car drivable by mid-May, we've still got a couple weeks to find out. Have a great week.